Good morning. I'm Brian Curtis.
And I'm Paul Allen. Here are the stories we're following today.
Well, it looks like a pretty solid day shaping up. The ASX with that slow start, not doing too much flat here at the moment, but equity futures are trading higher pretty much right across the region. That after the strong finish on Friday on Wall Street. The dollar is trading mixed after a steep fall on Friday. That was prompted by a miss on the U.S. jobs report for October, and we'll get you details on that. In terms of geopolitics, Israel says that its troops have entirely encircled Gaza City. That effectively means that the northern part of Gaza has been cut off from the south. We'll get more on that coming up shortly. Anyway, the effect on markets this morning is benign because we see futures tracking up. Hang Seng Index futures up 1.2%. China futures up about 0.6%. Nikkei futures at 32,770. And that would be suggesting a good 600 points of upside once the Tokyo market starts to open. We mentioned that the dollar had weakened on Friday. The Bloomberg dollar spot index was down 0.8%. We had yields dropping pretty significantly. The yield on the 10-year down to 4.57%. That was a drop of nearly 9 basis points. Now it's time for global news. U.S. Middle East diplomacy speeding up today. Ed Baxter has news from the 960 newsroom in San Francisco. Ed?
Yeah, definitely so, Brian. Let's go through it. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, after visiting Israel, has met with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas on the West Bank and then traveled to Baghdad, Iraq, to talk about the future of the region.
What we all agree is that in defining that future, in shaping that future for Gaza, for the West Bank, and ultimately for a Palestinian state, Palestinian voices have to be at the center of that.
And says he's tried to solidify the sentiment that Iran and his proxies not escalate any efforts toward peace.
I made very clear that the attacks, the threats coming from militia that are aligned with Iran are totally unacceptable, and we will take every necessary step to protect our people.
And meanwhile, evacuations of foreign passport holders and the injured from the Gaza Strip to Egypt have appeared to stall after more than 1,000 people crossed earlier this month. Blinken says a pause is being talked about to solve the issue, and
Israel's raised important questions about how humanitarian pauses would work. We've got to answer those questions. We're working on exactly that. In fact, we agreed that our teams would get together, and they're doing just that.
And what about the reports that several hostages have been killed in the Israel airstrikes on Gaza? Well, Deputy National Security Advisor John Feiner on ABC, as heard on Bloomberg, says this has not been confirmed.
We are not on the ground, the United States government, the United States military, not on the ground in Gaza, so it is very difficult to verify those claims. We obviously have deep concerns about the safety and well-being of Americans and others who are being held there.
Meanwhile, U.S. lawmakers have worked over the weekend on a stopgap measure needed to fund the government beyond the November 17th deadline and also look at funding for Israel. House Speaker Mike Johnson didn't mention a new timeline and is fighting back against Congressional Budget Office, saying that his taking funds for Israel from the IRS budget will increase the deficit.
Only in Washington can you cut funding, add a pay-for to a new spending measure, and they say that it's terrible for the deficit. Listen, we're trying to take care of our priorities, and we will. We know that these other important measures are right there on the table, and we're working through it hour by hour, day by day.
Yeah, Johnson says they're working to cut the ever-ending spiral of debt and deficit. Hong Kong's chief executive John Lee has condemned a bill proposed by U.S. lawmakers to sanction officials, judges, and prosecutors in the city. Bipartisan bid, lawmakers in the House and Senate call on President Joe Biden's administration to impose sanctions on 49 people who it said may be responsible for enforcing a Beijing-imposed national security law. And Ukrainian presidential aide has rebuked the nation's top military commander, offering a downbeat assessment on the counteroffensive against Russia. President Volodymyr Zelensky saying it is going well. As for a negotiated settlement,
we don't want to make any dialogue with terrorists. And the President of the United States and Congress, bipartisan support, all these people, they know that I am not ready to speak with the terrorists because their word is nothing.
Zelensky on NBC has heard on Bloomberg saying the U.S. understands his position. He will not negotiate. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. In San Francisco, I'm Ed Baxter. This is Bloomberg. Brian.
And coming up, we will be talking more about the Israel-Hamas war with Jonathan Panikoff from the Atlantic Council. Now it's time for the top business stories of the hour. Billionaire Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway is now sitting on a record pile of cash. We get that story from Bloomberg's Denise Pellegrini.
$157.2 billion in the third quarter. That's thanks to higher interest rates and also limited meaningful deals where Buffett could otherwise put his money to work. The conglomerate actually trimmed its overall equities portfolio in the quarter. And Berkshire also reporting operating earnings of $10.76 billion, a jump on the previous year thanks to elevated interest rates I mentioned on the cash pile and also gains at its insurance business. Overall, Berkshire posted a loss for the quarter, wider than the year prior, primarily due to losses on its equities portfolio. The firm also spent $1.1 billion on buybacks in the period, and that brings the total for the first 9 months of the year on buybacks to about $7 billion. Denise Pellegrini, Bloomberg Radio.
Friday's employment report in the U.S. showed a job growth moderate more than expected last month. The October non-farm payrolls report showed a gain of 150,000 jobs. The unemployment rate also rose a tick to 3.9%, and monthly wage growth slowed. Atlanta Fed President Raphael Bostic says policymakers now have time to watch how the U.S. economy is evolving, and he thinks they can be patient when it comes to interest rate moves.
Today, my outlook is that we're going to stay on that slow and steady. And if we continue to do that, then I think where we are now will be sufficiently restrictive to get us to the 2% level for inflation. But there's still a lot that's going to happen between now and even the next meeting.
And Bostic also said he thinks officials can get inflation to levels that are close to the Fed's target without seeing a recession. Brian.
Well, Wall Street is looking at another busy week ahead for earnings. Let's get the story from Bloomberg's Charlie Pellet.
Just over 400 members of the S&P 500 index have reported so far, and many U.S. companies have been putting on a better-than-expected show for their third-quarter results, boosting investor confidence. Nadia Lovell is senior U.S. equity strategist at UBS Financial Services.
The earnings season is coming in better than expected, and so we think that the outlook continues to improve.
Among some of the names reporting this week, the Walt Disney Company, ARM Holdings, Biogen, Devon Energy, D.R. Horton, UBS, and Uber. In New York, Charlie Pellet, Bloomberg Radio.
We go to China next, and Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is in Shanghai, hoping to improve ties between China and Australia, and there is some optimism on that front. Albanese says China will remain Australia's largest trading partner for the foreseeable future.
We want to see any impediments which are there for our trade to be removed and dealt with.
He's pleased by China's recent decisions on Australian barley and hay, and that both countries are on the path to restore wine trade. And he thinks foreign investment from China will continue to contribute to Australia's growth and the creation of jobs, but there is more work to do. Brian.
Meantime, Chinese Premier Li Qiang is vowing to boost imports and expand market access in China. Let's get the story from Bloomberg's Rashad Salamat.
Premier Li pledged to protect the rights and interests of foreign investors, telling the China International Import Expo Beijing would continue to promote opening up with greater inclusivity. The comments coming as foreign investment into China turned negative for the first time since records began in 1998. The country's been seeking to lure foreign investors back in an effort to aid its economic recovery. Meantime, Finance Minister Lan Fo-an said China would speed up the issuance of additional government bonds to ensure what he called an intensity of spending. I'm Rashad Salamat, Bloomberg Radio.
iPhone assembler Foxconn saw sales decline in October after China launched a probe into the company. Bloomberg's Joanne Wong has more.
The big iPhone maker reported a 4.6% decline in October revenue to the equivalent of $23 billion. Still, the company is sticking with what it calls a significant growth outlook for the December quarter. That's typically its busiest period given year-end iPhone shipments. This comes as Foxconn finds itself in the crosshairs of tax audits and a land use review by Chinese authorities. The investigation complicates Apple's position in its biggest international market. Investors are also growing more skittish about the iPhone's prospects in China. A new smartphone from Huawei has only added to that skittishness. In Hong Kong, I'm Joanne Wong, Bloomberg Radio.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Asia. I'm Brian Curtis, along with Paul Allen, and our guest is Jonathan Panikoff, Director of Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Jonathan, thanks very much for joining us. So, Israeli troops encircling Gaza City, we can talk a little bit about that. The Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, pretty aggressively traveling through the Middle East, and not least of which meeting with President Mahmoud Abbas in the West Bank. But I wanted to ask you about Israel suspending its heritage minister from cabinet meetings after he made the comments about the possibility of using an atomic bomb in the conflict. Now, even with that suspension, does that ratchet up the risk that we're facing with that conflict?
Well, good evening, and thanks for being with you. Good morning for those listening in Asia. Look, obviously, it was completely uncalled for. You've seen widespread condemnation, as there should be, not only from Israeli allies, including United Arab Emirates, but from Israel itself. Prime Minister Netanyahu threatened to push him completely out of the cabinet. Amichai Eliyahu is the minister's name. The reality is, look, he doesn't speak for the government, but he is part of the far right that has been very protective of the settler movement in the West Bank, a far right that includes folks like Bezalel Smotrich. And I think the concern is that it'll ratchet up tensions, frankly, not so much even in Gaza, but in places like the West Bank, where there's already been an increase in tension and hostilities. And if you see a real outcoming of violence from the West Bank, then it opens yet another front that Israel is going to have to deal with at a time that Israel, as well as, of course, the U.S., is desperately trying to keep this conflict isolated to just Gaza.
Yeah, the intention here really to prevent escalation. But you mentioned the West Bank, but we've also had Israel firing on Hezbollah targets in the north near the border with Lebanon. What's the significance of that?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, so this has gone back and forth now for quite a while, since the beginning of the conflict. There have been deaths from Israel Defense Forces soldiers. There have been deaths of Hezbollah members, and there have been deaths of civilians in the north. It's not getting the attention because it seems like all sides are desperately trying to keep it at a level below escalating it to what we see as a full-scale conflict. But, of course, that's an incredibly risky strategy. The chances for unintended escalation, that somebody responds too much or too far than had been anticipated, could quickly escalate this into a full-scale conflict, not that different than what we saw in the 2006 Hezbollah-Israel war. You heard Nasrallah, the Hezbollah leader, on Friday give a public speech. I think he clearly had the same message that they are defending Hamas, they are defending the ideology, and they are the vanguard against Israel, but trying to prevent it from actually escalating further. We're going to have to wait and see. Yeah. It's a risky strategy all around.
Jonathan, with Israeli troops encircling Gaza City, what's the strategy behind that?
Yeah, so really what it is it's about trying to cut off and deal with Gaza in portions so that you're not trying to deal with all of Gaza all at once. So what you're seeing is you've seen now for weeks Israel trying to convince people to move from the north to the south of the Gaza Strip. Hundreds of thousands have listened, hundreds of thousands haven't, and are very, very scared for understandable reasons. There's a history of Palestinians feel like they're being displaced. But for Israel, it's a bit of a catch-22, because if they didn't warn people as they try now to start an operation more meaningfully, then you would see even more civilian deaths than we have. What Israel is hoping to ultimately do is probably undertake what I would say are more precision-type strikes now. I think originally, as the conflict was starting, there was a concern that Israel would just go kind of full-scale from north to south. I think it has taken some U.S. advice and is now trying for a bit more precision. I think you'll see that. Yeah, please.
Is baked into the strategy the belief that the Palestinian leadership is somehow concentrated in Gaza City, and that if they're able to neutralize Hamas there, that they could almost then not have to continue with the ground push into the south?
I think that's probably part of it, but I think it's hard to tell. The Hamas leadership has a history of using underground tunnels, of using, frankly, ambulatory vehicles, of using any means to move around and try to get to protection. I don't obviously know. I think nobody does. The Israelis are not going to disclose it, what the intelligence is actually showing them. I think that what is probably true is that they know that a large amount of the weapons caches, a large amount of the command and control centers of Hamas, a large amount of the infrastructure that the terror cell has built up over the years is concentrated in Gaza City. And so this is, I think, a first step. If it's also a last one, then all the better for everyone. But I wouldn't want to say that we're there yet.
It's one thing, of course, to encircle Gaza City, but as we know, there is an impressive network of tunnels underneath the city. What's being done to nullify the impact of that?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think, look, the siege toward Gaza City is all part of this, right? I think you will see the IDF work to collapse a number of those tunnels, but to do so in ways that actually call for small munitions to try to limit the civilian casualties and the impact of even destruction. Obviously, those tunnel networks are vast. And having the intel is critically important. The one challenge really is, though, it's not quite clear where all the hostages are, obviously. I know that's something the U.S. and Israel are working on. Hamas has a history of not only its leaders hiding the tunnels, but using hostages to hide in the tunnels to try and convince Israel not to go that direction.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Asia, your morning brief on the stories making news from Hong Kong to Singapore and Wall Street.
Look for us on your podcast feed every day on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each day on Bloomberg 1130 in New York, Bloomberg 99.1 in Washington, Bloomberg 106.1 in Boston, and Bloomberg 960 in San Francisco.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Plus, listen coast to coast on the Bloomberg Business app, Sirius XM Channel 119, the iHeartRadio app, and on Bloomberg.com. I'm Brian Curtis.
And I'm Paul Allen. Join us again tomorrow for all the news you need to start your day right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Asia.